Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce the speaker for this evening. This is the last Sussex Universe lecture of 2023. So, yes, a big welcome to everyone. And Gilly is going to be talking to us this evening, and I just want to give you a little bit of background. Gilly and I are both hail from the States. So Gilly earned her BSc in cognitive science from the University of California at San Diego. The UC that's like at the bottom end of California. Meanwhile, I was doing my psychology degree up at UC Davis nearer the top. And she then completed a PhD in experimental psychology at Oxford. Importantly for us, she came to Sussex to do a postdoc in the early 2000s. And then we were lucky enough to get her back as a professor here a couple of years ago. So she is a professor of comparative cognition, and her research aims to better understand how we became the modern humans that we see around us today. So she does that through looking at the evolution of our species, so comparing humans and great apes, but also through looking at the development of human infants. And she is very dedicated to engaging the public in science. She managed to have a public engagement gig at Glastonbury, which I think that just goes to show quite how cool she is. So I know that we are in for a treat this evening. She is going to be talking to us about the language puzzle. Okay, welcome.
Well, thank you everybody for coming out on such a cold and rainy winter's evening. I'm Gillian Forrester, and I'm going to talk to you today about how we became upright walking, talking, tool-using great apes. But for me, it's super important to do something like this, do public engagement events where I get to speak to the public, because I think it's absolutely critical for scientists to bring their research to the public and share it. Because we need to be able to relate to what's going on in the lab. We need to understand why it's important that we're doing the research we're doing and answering the questions that we are. And often I'm able to distill those reasons by speaking to members of the public like yourselves. So thank you so much for coming along. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to show you a little bit about what we're currently doing with our public research. We've actually got a whole public research platform called Me Human, which I launched in 2019. And for me, the importance of sharing my research with the public is because we are all great apes here living on this planet and sharing it with the rest of the animal kingdom. And it's really important that we understand how we fit into the natural environment. And that's what we do. And we do this not just as academics, but our public engagement team is comprised of academics, students, volunteers, and importantly, family as well. So it's been a wonderful experience and growing, and a way to, like I said, keep in touch with the general public as well and understand how our research fits in to the rest of the world. So today I'm going to talk to you about the language puzzle. I'm super interested in how we became who we are today, and how our cognition emerges over evolutionary time, but also how it develops in infants. So we are upright, walking, talking, tool-using apes. We create rituals. We have a sense of self, and we keep track of time. So these are all things that look very special, and we kind of think of them as human unique capabilities. And when we study these things, particularly our language, which we can't really see in its current form in any other animal species, when we study these things, we tend to study them as human unique capabilities, and that we have these special brain regions that help us do these things. So if you've studied any psychology, or you've looked at even kind of new scientists or in the general media, you might have heard that we've got a left hemisphere dominance for language processing. So we've got this area that Paul Broca recognized in the 1860s that does speech production. And you might know also that many of us are right-handed. As a population, we're all right-handed, and each side of the brain operates the opposite side of the body. So because we've got this incredible use of language, and it's highly associated with a population-level right-handedness, we've always studied language in isolation of any other species. It's a human unique thing. This is traditional psychology's position. Likewise, you might have seen popular science and quizzes and so forth that say, are you left brain? Are you right brain? Are you analytical? Are you creative? You might see that most people who have a right hemisphere dominance, or they're left-handed maybe, are thought to be more creative. And we know for certain that we have a left visual field, right hemisphere dominance for recognizing faces, emotions, and identities. And these are just population patterns. Again, we take this to be unique to humans because we don't see any other animal species that have this sophistication in the way that they are able to deal with social stimuli. So we think it's all about us. And we study these things as complete products. We study them in the way that they are here today in modern humans. And we expect that infants born will develop these skills in the way that we have them as grown-ups. What we don't do is we don't tend to look at them in the framework of the whole kind of evolutionary journey of the brain, because it has one. Our human brains have an evolutionary journey, and there are processes that we can look at that contribute to the products that we have today. And that's where my research sits. So to try to explain now about where I come into the study of language and how we gained it through evolutionary time, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey first of how I think our brains have developed. So we see these things and we say they're human unique, but actually every single aspect of our human unique processes can be seen in some form in other animal species. For example, you might have heard that elephants have great memories. It's absolutely true. They are incredible in their ability to remember spatial places. So they will take their whole tribes to find the graveyards of their ancestors year upon year for many, many miles. So they're very good at long-term memory. Gorillas create culture. So they have cultural transmission of information that's different from group to group. Not something that's just hardwired and every gorilla does it, but they do it differently based on what group or family they're in. For example, when they eat, they like to eat communally, and they like to hum. It's kind of a chanting. And they have different chants for different qualities of food, and that's different from group to group. So they'll do this nom, 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 nom. It's almost like a sing-songy. And you can hear them as they start to make this noise, which again is different if they have something they really like versus something that's just so-so. Corvids, has anybody heard about corvids in the news and how intelligent they are? They are incredibly intelligent. They're not just tool users, but they're what we would call meta-tool users. This means they can't just solve a problem with a tool, but what they can do is if you give them a non-functional tool, so say, for example, we've got a little bucket with a handle and they need to pull the handle up to get some sort of reward out of it. If you give them a plain stick, a straight stick, and out of reach of this stick is a hooked stick, or some sort of wire, they will be able to use the non-functional stick to gain access to the functional tool to get the tool to solve the problem. Now this takes quite a lot of memory processing, right? So they need to hold in their memory, in their short-term memory, what the overarching goal is, and then create the steps along the way, these sub-goals, in order to solve the overarching problem. This is a very highly sophisticated resource that we really only attributed to humans. But no, corvids, like crows, are good metatool users. Dolphins, among a whole range of other species, can recognize themselves in mirrors. So there is a mirror test that we take for children. This is called theory of mind tests, called the Gallup test, which tells us whether or not an individual recognizes themselves as a person different from other individuals in a mirror. And by toddlerhood, most children can recognize that that is them in the mirror and not some other person. So the standard test is put a little dot on their forehead without them noticing, and then put them in front of a mirror. If they touch the dot, it means they recognized that that was them in the mirror, and that spot was on their head. So we can do the same thing for other animals, show them mirrors and show them with something on it. And we found that a whole range of animals, including dolphins, can recognize that that is them as an individual in the mirror. And dolphins like to look at things they couldn't see without the mirror, like down their throats, in their blowholes. And then what about language? Well, we can't see language, but we can see elements of language in other animals. So vervet monkeys, for example, they have words for predators. So they do this in the form of alarm calls, but they have different alarm calls for different kinds of predators. And everybody knows these words in their groups. So if they see an eagle, they're going to look up and shout eagle. Everybody else knows to look up and take the appropriate escape route. They've got a different word for snakes. So they actually have words, and we call this referential communication. So we can see these different kinds of behaviors are similar across animals, and maybe that shouldn't be a huge surprise because we are all vertebrate species, and we have evolved along a similar train with common ancestors millions of years ago. And we all have this very old vertebrate brain, and this vertebrate brain has some features that are still in our brains as well. So for example, we've got a hind brain, and that's like the brain stem in the back of the cerebellum. And this bit of the brain does things you don't want to have to think about, like regulate your breathing, keep your balance. We've got the midbrain, which is able to take in sensory information from the outside world to give you a sense of what's around you. We've got the forebrain, which then integrates all of that and gives you a full display of what your surroundings are like. And then this very front bit of this forebrain is the bit in humans which really grew and enveloped the rest of this old brain to form our two cerebral hemispheres. So this is what it looks like in all the different animal species if we were to look at the vertebrate tree of life. So all of those hindbrain, midbrains, and forebrains still exist across all these different lineages, from amphibians to sharks, reptiles, birds, mammals. They've just been pushed and pulled by different evolutionary pressures. And this is what it looks like in our brain today. So we still share so much of our brain evolution with other animal species. And one of the things that has maintained is that we've got the two sides of the brain that control the opposite side of the body. And this is true for all of our motor sensory processes, probably aside from our sense of smell or olfaction. So the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And about 30 years ago, some scientists thought, well, this is very interesting. Why is it just humans? Should we look a little bit deeper? And they started to look at other animal species to see maybe we were just being a little bit restrictive in the way we were viewing humans, and maybe we should see if other animal species also had these kind of divisions of labor for their different processes. And a seminal piece of work took place with a group of Italian scientists, Giorgio Valtgara and Australian scientist Leslie Rogers. And it's a really cool study. They took chicks, so little baby chicks, and they had them hatch. And when they hatched, they put them into a little laboratory setting where they put lots of grain, but it was mixed in with pebbles. So they had to concentrate on how they could get the grain. And they found that looking at many, many chicks over many, many trials, these chicks had a preference for putting their right eye to the ground to look for the grain and peck. So this was a preference for the species across all these birds. Not every single one, but there was a population bias. And because birds have eyes on the sides of their head, it's really easy to say that's a left hemisphere dominance for that species. Then they had a second task. The second task was that they flew a fake predator over these chicks. And over many, many chicks and many, many trials, they found that the chicks also had a preference for looking out for predators. They preferred to put their left eye to the sky, which suggests there was a right hemisphere bias for this type of activity. I thought that's really interesting. We're going to put both tasks together. And that they found was these chicks were very good at doing two of the most basic human or any animal survival techniques, which is feeding themselves while protecting themselves from being eaten by predators. So we've got a lovely brain here that does a bit of parallel processing. So these scientists suggested a theoretical premise that the divided brain was really useful for allowing the organism to eat and not be eaten at the same time. So if you have both tasks, you have one eye to the ground to look for food, one eye to the sky to look for predators. I thought, this is actually really interesting. Can we replicate this across other animal species? What they also found was that with these chicks, the better their division of labor was between the two tasks, the higher their survival rate would be. So this kind of brings about the question of what we call exaptation. And exaptation just means that we take some really basic processing and we extend upon it over evolutionary time. So I'll show you what I mean. If we start, for example, with the right hemisphere being better for these fight or flight, so this little chick who's better at looking with the left eye and the right hemisphere to the sky, looking out for predators, if we test that same type of skill with other animals, do we get a similar sort of result? So scientists all over the world started doing this across many vertebrate species, and they found that lizards, frogs, even sea mammals were doing exactly this same thing. We also found that the sea mammals not only were looking out for predators with the left eye, but they were also doing something else. They were also looking out for their young with the left eye. So they were moving that behavior, that thing where they were originally looking out for danger in the environment, and they started looking out for other kinds of social information, like nurturing behaviors. Then we see also that higher land mammals like sheep and dogs, they prefer to look for their social partners on the left side. So if they're in a herd or they're in a pack of dogs, they're often keeping everybody else over here because the right hemisphere is better at allowing them to look to see what their other social partners are doing and quicker to help them make a response if they keep them in that side. And then we find that gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans are not only doing that, but they're also nurturing their young on the left-hand side, with the suggestion that they're quicker to see if really vulnerable infants need help earlier and faster. They're also navigating their social environments, keeping their social partners on the left-hand side. And in humans, we know from the first days of life that infants prefer faces, and when we test humans, we have a population bias to recognize individuals, their social emotions, and their identities when they're in the left visual field. So this potentially lays out exaptation over evolutionary time. All of these behaviors are tied to right hemisphere bias for social information. And we can say a very similar thing about the left side of the brain, which originally started out as being able to feed ourselves. So these motor action sequences allowing us to feed, which is like pecking at the grain. And then additional studies on other animals like lizards and frogs found that if you were to test them, they did exactly the same thing. And there were some beautiful tests with, who knows what a lazy Susan is? Yeah? So they took lazy Susans and they put, say, a frog or a lizard in the middle of it. And lazy Susans, they were to serve hors d'oeuvres and dinner parties in the 60s and the 70s. And the middle circle would stand still and the outer circle would rotate. So you'd put the animal on the inner circle and then you'd put a prey on the outer circle and rotate it around, and you could see when the animal went for that prey. So you could see whether or not it preferred it in its left eye or its right eye. And after testing many animals over many, many trials, we see that this left hemisphere right vision just holds true across the board. Now what's interesting is when we get to primates, like monkeys, this gets extended to hand dominance. So anything that is a behavior that requires motor action sequencing, particularly to solve a problem that has a goal, so not just repetitive chest beating, for example, but maybe feeding behaviors or having to use tools and solve problems, we're seeing right hand dominance emerge. We're seeing this with great apes. We now know that all great apes are tool users. And across all the great ape species, there is a right-hand dominance for using tools, just like us. We see it in humans, and we see that it's not just modern humans, but we can see that this right-handedness is actually something that dates back for tool-using humans for millions of years. And we also know that we are right-hand gesturers, and now we know that it's the left hemisphere that is dominant for our speech. So we really do think that these are all things that have been exacted over time off this very early dominance of the left hemisphere for motor action sequencing. Does that make sense? Bit weird, different way to think of things, but it's really interesting because natural selection doesn't build new brain modules. Chomsky, I'm sure, would have liked us to believe that there was a special bit of brain that's just for humans and just for language, but actually it seems that Broca's region that we've always attributed to language is nothing more than a motor processor that we've exacted upon. So we've adopted it, adapted it, extended it, and now it's good for language. And what's cool about that is that you can have two behaviors that look nothing like each other on the surface, like tool use, for example, and language, yet the thing that's actually driving them could be one very much more simple brain processing area. And that's what we think goes on with language. So that hand dominance is for motor action sequencing is no different from the motor action sequencing that's required for language, because your brain doesn't care if you're a verbal speaker or a signer. It's the same bit of brain that's doing that work. And same for the right hemisphere and processing of emotion. So this is just to say it's not all about me. It's not all about us as humans. It's about human brains in a wider context of evolution. And that's what's so cool. But what's also cool is this left and right hemisphere dominances have been preserved. And they're still here in modern humans. Now, it doesn't ever mean that you're only using one hemisphere for certain tasks. We always use both sides of our brain in everything that we do. But there are these slight dominances, and they have been preserved in modern humans. So hands up who's right-handed. See that is probably 90% of the room. Left-handers? Yeah, our perfect kind of 10% maybe. You're probably not sure, though, if you are left or right visual field dominant for social stimuli. So we could have a quick check. There's a behavioral task we can do, which is quite nice, to see whether or not you've got this standard, which is what the other vertebrates we're talking about have as a majority. But it's possible that you could have crowded on the left, crowded on the right, or even reversed. And we know that these differences and variabilities can take place, and they're quite interesting to look at because they can also be linked to different developmental outcomes. And I won't get to talk to you about those today, but they're very exciting, and we've got a project going on about them at the minute. Okay, so you probably know if you're left or right-handed already, and actually a lot of left-handers still have the same brain organization as right-handers, but just for fun, if you're right-handed, you probably have made that decision because you know what hand you write with, but just for a moment, imagine also that you're threading a needle. One hand is going to hold the needle, and one hand is going to put the thread through the eye of the needle. So your dominant hand is the one pushing the thread through. So bimanual tasks are a more sensitive way to measure hand dominance, and actually, hand dominance is not binary. It's not your left or your right. You can be weakly, moderately, or strongly lateralized, and these are some of the things that we look at as well. But just for the minute, go for your binary, I'm left or right. Now, I'm going to show you these two images, and I want you to tell me which one looks more expressive. This is 1A, 1B. A, B. A, one more time, A, B. Hands up who thinks A, hands up who thinks B. Okay, so you see here there's a big majority for A. There are no difference between these two images. These are what we call chimeric faces. They are just swapping them around. We've got a neutral expression on one side and a smile on the other. The effect, the saliency, the difference in the expression that you see is just because you're looking with one visual field more dominantly when it's on, say, for example, this side. I'm looking at the smile now with my left visual field. That's my dominant hemisphere for social emotion, and the other one is in the opposite side. So if you thought A was, you are a right hemisphere, left visual field, standard brain profile. And if you thought B, well then it's likely that you're the reverse. So, what we're thinking about here is it's not all about us, but can we use this information to think about how modern humans evolved our different capabilities that look different on the surface, but may not be so different really, particularly language. So let's go to language. What is language? Does anybody even have a definition of language? It's a really difficult thing to define. Communication verbally. Good. Does it have to be verbal?
Okay.
No?
I say anything.
Nice. An encoding system for communication. Anybody else? Yes? Fantastic. Okay. Anybody else? Yes? Organized meaning. Oh, I like that. Very good. These are great answers because you're taking it out of the context of semantics and phonetics and the language things that linguists would talk about. So I would say it's voluntary. So these are the things that are different from other animal communication systems I'm going to tell you about. It's voluntary. We can decide to inhibit or when to express language. A lot of animals cannot. So if they're going to make, say, an alarm call, it's a reflexive action. It just happens, and they can't inhibit it, but we can. It is generative. That means you can always make something new out of it. Our language system allows us to always create a new set of words or thoughts. So you could put a sentence together now that no one's ever said before. And it's socially transmitted. An infant born today, if they were not exposed to language, would not develop language, right? We know that. And so it needs to be socially transmitted. And it's structured. So we have semantics, which are the meanings of the words, but if we don't put the words in the right order with this particular structure, we don't get any meaning out, right? And it's amodal. So that bit of the brain, we talked about Broca's region, that is good for speech production, does not care if you sign or speak. It is exactly the same bit of the brain that is operating it. So, with that in mind, we in evolutionary theories suggest that syntax, which is that structure of requiring to put the words in the right order to get the right meaning out, didn't have to emerge first with the kind of language we have now. It could have emerged earlier in a physical form. And so what we want to look for is not necessarily the verbalization or the alarm calls of other primates to see if we have maybe adapted those, but whether or not also there are animals who are making gestures that have structure. Or are there other behaviors that early humans did that have structure that could have been a precursor to language? Well, one of the most exciting theories is tool use theory. And it just suggests that tool use has a similar structure to language. You've got to put the actions in the right order to get the right result out. If I'm going to hammer nails into wood, I want to make sure that I pick up the nails first, then I pick up the hammer, then I place it over the wood and I hammer it into the wood. Because if I don't do it in that order, I'm going to have a very sore thumb and injure myself. And that's very much like how we work with language. If I have the sentence, the dog bit Jane, makes total sense. We know what's happened there. If I said, dog bit Jane doesn't make any sense. If I said, Jane bit the dog, you might question it, or Jane's been very naughty. And this is what we think maybe tool use has given us. Tool use might have given our hands the ability to create syntactic structure in the same sort of way that we've adapted for language. And it might also help us understand why a lot of scientists who work with children always find that there's this positive association between the way children develop their fine motor and their gross motor skills and how they go on to develop their social and communication skills. So, for example, kids who have typical looking motor milestones, they stand, they walk, they do all the fine motor grasping at the right stages, tend to go on to have typical language and other communication skills, whereas children who have difficulties with their motor skills early on tend to struggle with their language. But we've never had a theoretical context or framing to put that information into. So looking at our kind of evolution of our brain and how our hands and our mouths are connected with motor action sequencing using the left hemisphere as this processor is a new way to kind of consider this information. So these are theories, that's great, but how do we actually get real data around it? How can we actually test them? It's a really, really difficult thing to do. We can't ask this guy, he doesn't exist anymore. And language doesn't fossilize, so we can't dig language up, but we can dig up artifacts. And we know we've been stone tool users for about 3.4 million years. And we know that those stone tools actually show that we were already right-handed, because you can tell by the way that the stone knapping occurred. And we use the same tools for everything. So this is one tool for all contexts. But about 100,000 years ago, we find these different, more sophisticated tools popping up in different regions. And they're what we call hafted tools. That means you've taken different materials and you've bound them together and you have specific tools for different contexts. And archaeologists just thought, well, hey, if these things are showing up in different places, then we must, at this point, have a communication system that allows us to communicate across our communities and down generations. We must have some sort of language. That's it. That's where we come to. 100,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, we had language. But that's the information we have. It's not very sturdy, and it's difficult. What we also know that's happening concurrently is that humans stood up 4 million years ago. We became bipedal. And at this point in time, our hands became freed up to do other things. So we started using and making tools. And if this was all going on and we're teaching other individuals how to use and make tools, we're creating competition for what our hands can do. So we do think that we started gesturing first as a human sort of communication system. But just think now, if I want to make something and I want to gesture to you about how I'm making it, I've got conflict because my hands can't be doing both activities at the same time. So the theory is that we've also had this gestural theory where we've moved our communication system from our hands to our mouths so that we could both do things with our hands and communicate at the same time, which is kind of an interesting theory and really useful, and also helps us make sense of why fine motor and language skills are always linked in children. But it's really hard to test, again. So another way that we can try to test this is to look at our closest living relatives. So great apes, we are great apes. We sit in the great ape family tree. We're not at the top. We are nested inside of it. We are actually genetically closer to chimpanzees than chimpanzees are to gorillas. All great apes are tool users. And interestingly, over the last kind of couple decades, we've worked out that all great apes have Broca's region that is anatomically larger in the left hemisphere than in the right, just like ours. But they're not speaking, but they are using tools. And then another lovely study has shown that in humans, that same area that we use for language is activated also when we're using tools. So these are quite nice pieces of evidence. The other nice thing to studying great apes is that we share much of the function and structure of our brains. Our hands are very similar in morphology, and our eyes are as well. We have forward-facing eyes. They're like targets, so they have a darker iris and a lighter background, which is called the sclera, which means you can follow the eyes quite nicely as targets. And so my postdoc, Dr. Georgina Donati, and I decided we need to make a study that allows us to look and test the tool use theory, test to see if we can get some data on whether or not syntax and the way that we think language could have emerged actually has some legs. So we created a hand-to-mouth project, and we created physical syntax in the form of puzzles. How am I doing for time, Allie? Okay, cool. So this is the language puzzle, and we thought, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? It's very, very difficult to create a study that truly is translational across species. Think about the fact that we wanted to test children, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. The first thing you cannot do is have a study that requires verbal instruction. You have to have something that's intuitive that all of them can do equally without the confound of different kinds of instructions. So we made boxes. Here's some early ones that we made that were little prototypes. Basically, you pop, pretend this is a hazelnut in the front. You have openings where you push it through and you try to get it to go through the maze. It's stuck firm to a grating, so you're just able to get to the holes and move it around. And we wanted them to represent different elements of language. So this flat maze, you put the nut in the top, you push it through, you get it out the bottom, you can eat it. And we thought this was kind of like a noun. It's very concrete. You always know where you are. You can always touch the nut and move it. Whereas a cog, where you couldn't touch the nut, but you could move the cog that moves the nut and give it action, we thought this was kind of like a verb. And then we have a double cog. Now, when the nut comes in, you can't move this cog, but you can move the cog that moves the cog. So you have to understand how these mechanisms work together. So this is kind of like you could think about an adjective modifying a noun. Then we thought, okay, here are our components in the most simplistic form, but what do you do with them? You make sentences. So then we made their sentences where you have all the components in there, but you also have something novel that they haven't seen before, because we said language is generative and you need to be able to deal with new creations. So we've got a rocker here where if you don't tip it this way and you tip it that way, you lose the nut in the trap. And in this one, if you don't turn these double cogs the correct way, if the nut falls down here, it's in a trap as well. If you get it this way, you can get in, push it over the hill, down. Right, so now the test. Here are our participants. We've got some fantastic orangutans at Twy-Cross-Zoo. We've got some amazing chimpanzees also at Twy-Cross-Zoo. We've got another group of gorillas at Portland Wild Animal Park. And we've got children across a range of different mainstream schools aged 2 to 6. And our children, we built them also a frame because we thought if the apes have to work through a frame, so do the kids. We want to make it equally challenging. And our predictions were, if we've truly tapped into syntax with our puzzles, then our kids should be able to solve the puzzles that are equal to their level of language learning. So if we've got a 1-year-old or 2-year-old who are using single words, then they're probably only going to be solving the single word or the phrases boxes. And if they're solving or speaking full complex sentences, then they should be able to work out the syntax of the complex boxes. And if great apes can solve these puzzles, now everybody we spoke to when we were developing this project said absolutely no way are apes going to solve any of these, particularly gorillas will not be interested at all. Give up, go home. But our hypothesis nonetheless was if they can solve these, then here's a bit of real evidence that syntax can be seen in a physical form in apes, and therefore we'd expect it was inherited from a last common ancestor and not unique to humans. And if we see right-hand dominance here, then this would be a marker of the left hemisphere dominance for language syntax. So, here are just some examples of some kids. This is an 18-month-old. And I've sped this up just so we see an 18-month-old, even though they've got tiny little fingers, are still pretty good at getting in there. Certainly can solve. Now, these were fake nuts there because of nut allergy issues, and so we just gave them a sticker at the end of their session. Didn't seem to matter to them. They didn't really care. This is a 3-year-old trying to solve complex sentence one. You can see she's got the rocker, she's going to go the wrong way, she thinks about it, goes away, she's not giving up, she's got herself a stick, and there we go, solved it. So our children were amazing, 2-year-olds to 6-year-olds. About 50 of them took part in this across a few different nurseries. And we wanted to ask, across time, are these languages are their language abilities and their puzzle abilities associated with one another? And this would be asking also, is the hand and the mouth connected? And what we found, and these are still preliminary because we're still analyzing some of the data, was that the more nuts that they were able to collect, the better their language was. And also, the more complex the boxes were that they could solve, the better their language was. So this is a really nice way to say we've tapped into a bit of syntax here. So we're quite excited about that. And that's just the kids. Okay, the apes. Hands up, who thinks a gorilla can solve this puzzle? Who thinks not? A little mixed. This is Tibbs. She is a 34-year-old Western lowland gorilla at Port Lim Wild Animal Park. She comes with the stick already. She also makes a little hay pile because she likes a comfy seat to sit on while she's working. And she was probably our most enthusiastic participant. Patience.
Yes, that's a real nut.
That is a real nut. So yeah, we haven't done them with fake nuts to see, but it would be interesting to see if they would do it anyway. We did find that they played with them even if... See, she's got some stuck in the trap there. She's just very gentle over the hill. She's clearly learned. And I found that with the gorillas, they were able to solve them in about a minute. So, obviously over time they were getting used to them as well. Okay, what about orangutans? Hands up if you think the orangutans can solve them. Ooh, less than the gorilla. This is a 4-year-old orangutan. She's called Cayenne, and she's at Trois Croix. She was probably our most dexterous participant. And she had to do it really fast because her little cousin was always on hand to steal the goods as she got it out. So she was always looking over her shoulder. In fact, we found that a lot of the apes would use child labor. The parents would watch the kids. They'd pry it from their hands. No sharing there. But yeah, she was very good. About 48 seconds she would be able to solve that with, faster than a lot of our adult participants. Okay, 13-year-old Thule, a chimpanzee, hands up. Indeed, Thule could do this too. Thule was pretty quick. He didn't always even need a tool. Pretty good with fingers. She's thinking there. You see, if she went the wrong way, she'd be in the trap. Once it's in the trap, there isn't a good way to get it out, and that's how it's supposed to be. So yeah, 31 seconds she could solve that in. So what we found was some individuals in every species could solve these tasks. Not all of them, but some individuals in every species. So a lot of individual variability, which suggests that syntax is probably not unique to humans and not unique to language. It has a precursor, probably in tool using or solving problems with our hands. We are using syntax when we make a sandwich, when we cook, when we do lots of different things. But what we found with the apes and the children was that if they were solving just with the finger versus if they were solving with a tool, the handedness increased and went more right-handed if they picked up a tool. So we think what's happening here is that if you pick up a tool, you have to have more precision, right? So you're having to make a precision grasp, and that requires you to have a lot more dexterity, which might pull on more of this left hemisphere dominance for motor processing. We also found that the more complex the boxes became, the more the individuals were prone to use their right hand. Again, suggesting that we've got this left hemisphere dominance playing a role in these behaviors. But certainly, we could suggest from these data that syntax is not unique to language and not unique to humans. But what are some of the other nice things that we saw was that, we can see that there's structure. These are sped up, but you can see she's testing the bottom before she even starts. So she understands that this is not just trial and error. She understands that she has to understand the physical mechanisms here and how they work together. Here's an example of voluntary. So I said language is voluntary, and we were talking about it in that it's reflexive versus I can inhibit if I want to or speak when I want to. Well, here's an example where this gorilla wasn't doing it for the food because she'd bring lunch to the box. Here she is taking breaks and eating an onion. That was clearly not for the food, but I think solving cognitive tasks like language is inherently rewarding. We like to do it. It gives us a bit of a high. It makes us feel good. We like to solve problems and puzzles. We are curious creatures. And there she's put her stick in there as a resting place. It's also generative. So we've made these boxes thinking that there's one way to solve them. They showed us that there are many ways to solve them. And so they were quite ingenious. So here's this gorilla working out that if I put more than one at the top, she doesn't have to work them through the box. You can jam a stick in. I mean, that's fantastic, right? It's really innovative. This is Batu. Batu is an alpha orangutan, and his fingers are like truck tires. And we didn't think about this when we made the hole sizes for... He just really can't fit his fingers in. So Batu can solve the puzzle with a stick in his mouth. But Batu never worked out how to work the trap. Got it stuck in the trap almost every time. So he had another solution, which is just as valid, even though we weren't so keen on it. That was we had to take Batu out of the study after this one. We couldn't reinforce the boxes well enough. And then, of course, we see that it's socially transmitted. So you might see here, let me push this bit forward, there's a baby there, right? So this is little Vuko, and Vuko is going to learn from watching her mom, just as we learn from watching our social partners and our parents. So we know that information is socially transmitted in apes as well. Teaching, we saw evidence of teaching, which is amazing because we're told that humans are the only ones who teach, but I would say that this is quite a nice example of teaching. These are two chimpanzees who are best friends. One of them knows how to solve it, the other one doesn't. Shows, and then she invites her friend to come and solve it. I mean, we need to just look to see how closely we are related and how many of the capabilities that we have are just inherited from a last common ancestor, but we've extended upon them. We're not unique in that sort of way that we like to think we are. How much time have I got, Ali?
5 minutes, but we're all enjoying it. So
well, then I'll show you this one because I love this. My postdoc put this one together. This is another bit of innovation because I told you there was a trap. And when we were collecting data, we have to go on a lunch break, and we set the video on time lapse. Left with 8 nuts in the trap. Came back, there were no nuts in the trap, and we couldn't work out how they came out. I thought a squirrel got in the box. So I don't know how much you can see, but she's got a pliable stick, and she has modified it to a hook, tuning out from beneath and flinging them over to the other side, where she can then move them over the hill. Yeah, so I mean, suggesting they are premeditating these behaviors, there's a lot of thought going into it, and they're just behaviors that we just don't give other animals credit for. They're incredibly intelligent, intuitive, and they create new ways to solve problems. Dropped a nut out the side there, had to get that one too. But, you know, for her. She actually taught us how to clean them out. So when we take the boxes to festivals, we now know how to get the nuts out of the trap without having to take the whole apparatus apart. Right. You get the idea. And another thing we realized is that apes, just like us, are incredibly resilient. So even though they can't solve a problem necessarily on the first try, they will go have another go. If things are too boring, we might stop. If they're too hard, we might get frustrated and stop. How precious is that? That's little Kundi. He never solved anything beyond the flat maze. He did solve this one, never went any farther, but never stopped trying. Never stopped trying. It's the great kind of resilience. And this is Kibria when we were first piloting the boxes, telling us that they were empty. So I want to just take 2 minutes to tell you about where this research is going, because sometimes science is unpredictable and whimsical, and it's lovely to be able to be creative with it as well. And because my colleagues and I are all conservationists as well, we want to understand how we can also help other great apes. We've spent so many decades using them as models to better understand ourselves, but we've now hit a point in time where we understand as humans, our physical well-being isn't the only part that gives us quality of life, it's our psychological well-being as well. And if we understand how psychological well-being is important for us and how it manifests in us, maybe we can use ourselves as a model to better understand them. So one of the things that these puzzle boxes, so this is just to say we should be turning the tables and using us to help them. But one of the things that we noticed with the apes is that they love the boxes and they sit really still while they're doing the boxes, and it allows us to gather other kinds of information. So in humans, we know that stress is really one of the things that can make our quality of life difficult. Some stress is good. We all need a bit of stress to get up out of bed in the morning and do our jobs and be motivated and go to school. But too much stress can be debilitating. And just as we are great apes as they are, we live in social structures where we don't always want to show our behaviors. So if I'm super stressed, I might not want everybody else to know. So we do a lot of masking. Well, these guys do too. And the only ways that we could record their stress previously is either by looking at their behavior, which may not be accurate, or by collecting fecal samples, hair samples, things that have cortisol in them that allows us to see residual stress, which is old, like it might have been from weeks or months ago. We can't see time-sensitive information. But if they're sitting still, we can. And what we decided to do was take these boxes out to Africa, to some of the sanctuaries, and this is where these photos come from, to see if we could use a thermal imager to look at their arousal levels. And a thermal imager is great because there's a signature arousal in humans that's the same in great apes. Our noses change temperatures when we get stressed. So if we're really scared, and I gave you a jump scare like you're watching a horror film and you've had a fight or flight response, your temperature of your nose decreases because blood rushes away from your cheeks and your nose to go to your eyes so you can pay attention to what's around you. It's just an evolutionary response to stress. So we can see that in us humans, and we can take video and watch. And not only can we see how stressed they are, but we can see how long it might take them to come back down to baseline. So we're currently doing some pilot work with apes in Cameroon. And the whole point is that you can see all the data behind every pixel. Every bit will tell me what temperature it is, and I can see how it changes over time. But we're using it to see if individuals are stressed, and also if they're stressed around other individuals in particular. So our collaborators in Africa are looking to see which animals they can pair with one another. They might have orphans coming in and want to know if there are potentially good adoptive parents, or will these individuals house together nicely? And they don't have any other way to go on it aside from watching their behaviors, which may not be reflective of actually how they're feeling. So what we're doing is going out to look and see. And you can see this individual's got a really cold nose. We just showed her a baby. because we were hoping she might be an adoptive mum. This took 15 minutes to come back to nearly baseline. She didn't end up being the right mum for this one. Her self-regulation wasn't great, and she didn't want the baby in the end, but the baby's now paired with another individual. But it has some real applied, practical, hopeful ways that we can use these data. This is a lovely lad called Dixon, a chimpanzee who the keepers think is depressed and agoraphobic. He won't go out of his enclosure. And he has a constantly low nose temperature. So these could be signature markers of different mental health conditions that apply also to apes. And even here you can see, even though we can't take their blood pressure, thermal imaging allows you to see respiration. Can you see the nose? We can check their breathing rates. So there's all kinds of interesting things that we can do. Okay, so the last 2 minutes. If you've enjoyed this, we love doing public engagement with the Me Human team. Of course, we take our work to the media, but we also love to take it to non-science self-selecting audiences, like Ali was saying, Glastonbury, and that's been amazing. If you want to find out more, it's the mehuman.io website. And the whole point is to take science from the lab to you. And as I said, it involves family, friends, volunteers. You don't have to have a scientific background to get involved. In fact, it's great to have people on board who don't have a scientific background so they can help us liaise with the public in a more real way. These are the boxes have gone to Glastonbury and people had a great time. They're not very good at solving them. The chimps and the gorillas and the orangutans are better. But we had some great challenges and it was lots of fun. And we took the thermal camera as well and showed people how stress works. We've been all over from the Science Museum to the Royal Society, Glastonbury, Blue Dot, and we've got a really fun 2024 coming as well. We also like our widening participation, special educational needs schools, National Saturday Club, and some activism as well. So if it is something that you think would be of interest, come along. And we take feedback. We always take feedback and try to be responsive to what people think of the science in the community. And for 2024, yes, we'll be back at Glastonbury, and we also will be taking our Baby Grow project to Glastonbury and the Royal Society's Summer Science event. And this is a study taking our understanding of how motor is so important for cognition and looking at it from birth. So this is an ongoing study currently. If you know anybody who's pregnant and having a baby in the next 6 months, you might want them to have a look. It's all done in the home, and we are using motor sensors to track babies' motion from birth and looking to see how that correlates with their social communication development. And I can't even begin to thank all of the people, because there's so many people who are involved in these researches and groups and funders. But I'm going to stop there because I've probably gone over time. So thank you so much for your attention. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. What great videos. That was so engaging. That's shown us all how to do public engagement. We have time for questions.
So, when it was free last night, Ollie, monkeys, and they're not nicking food. Sunglasses, flip-flops, and iPhones, so they're not smashing them. Even older, if someone thinks appropriate response. They have cognitive food.
I think we're meant to repeat the question, which I'm going to find tricky, but I'll do my best. So you saw this on a program, did you say?
Planet Earth 3.
Planet Earth 3. Maquette monkeys were 10-point...
A temple in Bali.
A temple in Bali. Okay, we're getting there. And these monkeys were basically taking people's things hostage. Okay. Flip-flops, iPhones, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So they wait, and then the tourists have to bring something suitable. So you think that's cool?
Is that cognitive fluidity? Yeah.
I'm not sure what the definition is of cognitive fluidity, but I would definitely say that they have learned how the economy works there, right? Pardon?
It's not civic exchange.
No, it's bartering. Yeah. No, it's incredibly sophisticated, and they probably know the value of each one. They probably know they're not going to get as much for their sunglasses as they are for the iPhone. And they don't break them, no, because they probably also learned that if they break them, they don't get the reward. But yes, I mean, it's incredibly, it's social learning, right? These are kind of almost, you'd say, potentially ritualistic kinds of behaviors. None of these are hardwired. They've learned from experience. And they've probably been able to learn not just from their own experience, but by watching others have responses that were advantageous or not. Exactly. Yeah, great question.
Yeah. Is it better to drive on the left or drive on the right? Yes.
Gosh, that's a really interesting question.
It is.
I don't know if there's any research on that specifically, so I wouldn't like to hazard a guess. But obviously, if you're driving on the left, you know, you've got your left visual field dominance that way, but you're not really looking out for social information. You're looking for conflict, predators. I'm not really sure. It's an interesting question. Yeah. Does anybody else know?
Could explain why roundabouts work in the UK but not in the US.
Truly just experience, I think, and training. So if you learn your driving early with roundabouts, you're good. But it's kind of like learning a second language. If you learn it early during a sensitive plastic period, you're going to be able to do those things. Whereas if you learn it later as an adult, you're always going to have an accent, and you're always going to have trouble with your roundabouts.
I think we need to have gorillas and chimpanzees drive in both.
Yeah, they sometimes steal boats as well when on the research sites. That has happened too.
Is Chomsky's language acquisition
So is Chomsky's language acquisition device now only of historic interest?
I mean, I would definitely say that you're not hardwired for language, because we know that it doesn't develop if you're not triggering it. So there isn't kind of like a nativism in the same kind of way that he expressed it originally. I think he came with some more compromising his theories a bit later on, but the idea that you've got a human unique module that is language specific, I think, has been clearly proven wrong.
What about the anatomy? Is it possible?
Yeah, so there are some different factors that came into what we think were the catalysts for speech. So if you just looked at the anatomy of a chimpanzee brain and a human brain, there's very little difference in Broca's region and Wernicke's regions, which are speech production and comprehension. Anatomically, the whole chimpanzee's brain's a bit smaller, but those are similar proportionately to ours. What changed, we think, is that when we became bipedal and our hands became freed up, as we know that modern apes are not, they're more still knuckle walking. We became more active with our hands. It had this feedback to that brain region for doing these different kinds of activities that still required motor action sequencing. But also when we became bipedal, our hips narrowed. So we birth our infants much earlier developmentally than other great apes do. And so this kind of has some repercussions in that they are very motor sensory underdeveloped in comparison, which makes actually the brain more plastic. So this gives them an advantage over learning socially transmitted information. So these are things that we think kind of like came together fortuitously. Also, when we became bipedal, the position of the skull on the neck changed kind of the way the back of the mouth is formed. So chimpanzees have been tried to teach how, these language studies from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, where they were tried to teach them just simple words, and anatomically they really struggled with them. And if they really held their mouth together, they might say like cup. But that was about it. And what we realize now is the way that our anatomy has shifted by the larynx dropping and also the back of the throat changing shape is that we now have kind of this cavern that allows us to have these open vowel sounds that apes can't produce. So again, all these things kind of together helped us.
Is there any example of language? For example.
So the question is there evidence that great apes can, oh God, I'm not going to be able to say this properly, can, for example, point and know that they're referring not to the finger, but to where it's pointing to.
Yeah. So this is called referential communication. And for ages, there have been debates that chimps don't point. It's a human unique thing. It's a precursor to learning your first words. You first point, you learn, then somebody tells you that is this thing and it's called that thing, and you share that information. But actually, apes that are what we call encultured, so they've been reared in human environments, they all learn to point and they understand pointing as well. So we've got plenty of pieces of evidence where apes will, point to a bit of food that didn't get into them properly, to somebody to give it to them. And then they also are able to use sign language to say words that they weren't taught, so more generatively. So, for example, I think it might have been Coco the gorilla who saw a swan and was able to say water bird, had the word for water, had the word for bird, and put the two together. So they have these capabilities. But certainly, yes, and most of the studies don't really compare humans and apes equally, because a lot of the reason why we have language is because of our rearing history. We've been exposed to these stimuli, and then apes haven't in the same sort of way. So they're not going to speak the same way we do for a range of reasons, but their ability to share attention with someone else and direct attention to things in space is not unique to us. They do have it. And in fact, pointing is not even how all humans point. So lots of studies just looked at pointing with the finger, but if you look around different cultures, lots of cultures don't point with the finger. They find it rude. They point with the chin, they point with the lips, they point with their eyes. Apes always point with their bodies and their eyes, and they do it much more. We do it at parties. If you want to get someone's attention and you want them to look somewhere, but you don't want to say it, we point with our bodies all the time, and apes do that very well.
I'm not sure if it's connected. Apes have.
So the question was, do apes have long-term memory or episodic memory? I mean, they definitely can plan and hold on to something and remember it and return to it. So I would suggest evidence of these kinds of things. So there's anecdotal stuff that we see all the time. There's one gorilla at one of the animal parks who will collect rocks for when certain visitors come. Have a pile of ammunition in the corner. But yes, I think it's so difficult because the way that we test cognition is often by using language to extract the information. So we have to think of other ways that we can extract this information more fairly across, because We've even found with looking at cognition of children that sometimes what we think we're testing, we're not really testing because we've got this confound of what the children actually understand from the instructions. And if they didn't all understand the instructions properly, of course it's going to have an impact on the way they perform on the task. So we've had to go back and do a lot of things properly. And I think comparative cognition is entering a new phase where we're realizing that the way we make these comparisons really matter. And we need to be more considerate of other animals and not have such human-centric versions of our tests.
Like a personal question, thinking back to the brain, where does being ambidextrous
So the question is about being ambidextrous.
Yeah, so these are population patterns that I'm talking about. And every population comes with variability. So individuals, and we want that variability within the population, and it's preserved. So we will always see that we keep kind of somewhere between 9 and 12% of left-handers in the population, and likewise, I think about 2 to 3% of very, properly ambidextrous people. And they come with their own advantages. There are different theories as to what those advantages are. For example, left-handedness, there are theories about that if you are doing competitive activities, that you approach your competitor from the unexpected side, giving you an advantage. There are also advantages for cognition with having this ambidexterity because you have more interhemispheric communication between the two sides. It often leads to people thinking more laterally. We find that there are more ambidexterity and left-handedness in the arts, in music, in politics. The rates of non-right-handedness rises in all these areas where we really need to kind of think more laterally.
Thank you.
Actually, more of a question for you, sir. Is how did you do on the two faces thing? Because there are in fact two of us in here, and I couldn't tell the difference between.
Oh, interesting. So obviously, I've just shown you one example, and if we were really going to test your dominances, we'd probably give you many trials, and then we'd look at the proportion of left-right choices that you chose, and that would tell us if you're weakly, moderately, strongly, or not at all lateralized. So one was just for fun, but it's pretty robust, even one, which is quite interesting. Did you choose left or right on
No,
the?
I couldn't tell.
You couldn't.
Again, not where my ambidextrity has polarised over the years. The older I become more deliberate on what I do with which one.
Yeah, and also with handedness, it's a funny thing because we talk about handedness as I'm better with this hand, than the other, but actually people are not that much better with if they're right-handed with their right hand than their left hand. It's a preference. So if I ask you to do something, you'll probably choose your right hand, but if I tested you on the accuracy of your left and your right hand, then there's probably not as much difference as you think. So for example, in one of these citizen science projects that we did, we had peg boards, and we had people put as many pegs in as they could, first with one hand, then with the other hand. And there's very little difference between the two. Although if I gave you both hands and said do the task, you would probably dominantly choose the hand you favor. So there are these are again two different ways to interpret what handedness is. Is it your preference or your performance?
Yeah.
What do you think would happen if you gave puzzles?
That's a good question. I think their hands are probably so small that they could just put it in and take the nut straight out, and I'd have to create different boxes. I don't know. So that would be a follow-up study to do. So now we've taken this and we've tested great apes. We haven't tested bonobos yet, but I expect they'll be just as good as our chimps, gorillas, and orangutans. But how far back do we think that goes is a fantastic question. And every time we do these tests, we're not suggesting that gorillas are less evolved than we are, or chimpanzees are less evolved. We're talking about them being a proxy for ancient humans. So we're talking about suggesting that they might represent the same skill sets that our last common ancestor had. So if we then go back in the tree to where we split from monkeys, and we found that they could do that, then we'd be able to say, actually, syntax is even older than that. But I think the rationale for using great apes is because we knew they were tool users as well. So I think we'd want to pick tool-using and non-tool using monkeys, maybe, and then have a nice little test to see if they're connected. But yeah, it's a great question. Next project.
Has there been any comparisons made to the first time we've done this is the way that humans can't use language because
I mean, all primates our primary sensory channel is vision. So we use a lot of body language, and I think that's probably no different. Now, you and me, even if we spoke different languages, we probably have some common social behaviors that are physical ones, whereas I don't know ape, right? So I'd have to learn it first, and then, yes, you could share. So, like, I know quite a bit of ape now, and I can build rapport based on those behaviors. But yeah, for sure, they use those same sorts of body language behaviors, particularly the eyes and the rotation of their bodies, because they use a lot of their visual gaze to communicate, their peripheral gaze to communicate information about what they're interested in.
Time for one last question.
Language.
So, if I understand, so the question is, at what point
might language have started to develop?
At what point would language have started to develop culture by?
By developing language using the syntax structure and.
Yeah, so at what point did storytelling... Yeah, I think I'm not the right person to answer this question. It's a very interesting one, but I think language is a tool for culture, right, for cultural transmission. At what point that it became a tool for narratives? I suppose you could see everybody learning how to make the same tool as kind of a narrative, right? So maybe that's how things start, and then it's always the sharing and the replicating of that thing that is thread, right? That goes across communities and down generations. But when it turned more abstract, I suppose probably closer to when the language moved more internal versus external. But I could be totally wrong with that, because I think there's probably lots of pantomiming dances, maybe. I'm the wrong person to ask. It's a fantastic question, but I can. You've got me intrigued now too, so I won't dig a hole any further. I don't know.
Well, thank you so
Thanks, everybody.
much. That was fantastic.